welcome to the Late Night News with myself, Jackson Haynes. Tonight, we're going to talk about French-English relations in the 20th century. We've many special guests tonight. First off, I'll be talking about the period between 1968 and 2000 and how that developed Canada's individual identity. Between 1968 and 2000, Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister twice, between 1968 and 1979, and between 1980 and 1984. He had a big effect on Canada and its individual identity. In 1968, when Pierre Trudeau was in office, the Official Languages Act was passed by the Parliament. And with this, it made Canada officially a bilingual country, which really set them apart from the States. And obviously gave them quite an identifiable identity. The Act stated that where a French or English minority in any district in Canada exceeded 10% of the population, bilingual government services would be provided. All documents would be published in both languages, and the federal courts throughout Canada were to be bilingual. The federal service would become bilingual in its operations and services to the public. About 1/5 of all federal civil service jobs were declared to be bilingual. Finally, a government official was appointed to moderate and settle any disputes over language policy. It was an ambitious, visionary policy. Now, a recap of that. Pretty much, the government wanted Canada to be bilingual, and this really gave them an unidentified identity, and that's a pro because it's a big step for Canada. Because compared to America, America was not bilingual. Canada was, and it's a big step for independence because Britain isn't bilingual either, and Canada, obviously, as you know, is a colony of Britain. So it's a big step for independence because it became bilingual. And also it makes the languages equal, which shows a Canadian aspect that Britain or America doesn't have, for example. But the cons of this is that upset some of the French-speaking people in Quebec and also in other provinces and also English-speaking people because the English speakers and immigrants who had learned English felt that they might have to learn a new language because the French people in the area were speaking bilingual languages. And a recap of what we were talking about earlier, the pros and cons of the Official Languages Act. The pros are the fact that it makes the two languages equal, which is a big step for Canada. Another thing is that it's a big step for the identity of Canada because it makes Canada's identity much different than America's identity or Britain's identity, which is very good. The cons is that people were convinced they were being forced to learn another language against their will. And also, Quebecers were against it because they thought that the French language, would die unless it was the only official language in Quebec. Also, there was a lot of bigotry against French people made English people not like the act because there was a lot of bigotry in the West and also in Ontario and other English-speaking places. So, to finally recap, the Official Languages Act was good for Canada's identity, but some people did not like it. Thank you. And on the next segment, I'll hand it over to Ernest Thompson to talk about the French-English relationship between 1939 and 1967.
Now.
Thanks, Jackson. That was very well said. Now on to French and English relations during the Second World War and post-war era. This was from 1939 to 1967. This was a very hard time for Canadians and Canada as it tried to grow its identity. Many of the events during this time period showed a lot of tension between Francophone and Anglophone Canadians. One very big event that brought a lot of tension was the conscription crisis of 1944. This conscription crisis greatly divided the French-speaking and English-speaking people of Canada. Conscription was introduced by William Lyon Mackenzie King when he went, and this was a very big shock because he went back on his original promise to not bring conscription into this war. The French-speaking people of Canada did not want to be conscripted to a war that Canada was not directly involved in. This created a lot of tension throughout Canada, as many of the English-speaking people were okay with this being passed, but many of the French-speaking people opposed it. This greatly divided the views of the French-speaking and English-speaking Canadians as they were unsure on how to proceed during the coming war efforts. During the 1960s, a terrorist group known as the Front de Libération du Québec started a lot of tension within Canada because it showed that some French Canadians very much opposed the Canadian government and how Quebec was being treated. French Canadians were trying to introduce French-only laws in an attempt to preserve French culture. This was detrimental to a unified Canadian identity as the Canadian people were becoming separated by our two languages. The English-speaking Canadians were trying to include French into the rest of our country, but the French English Canadians were trying to separate it and trying to create French-only laws. So even as the English-speaking Canadians were trying to accept
Keep going.
Now on to the conscription crisis of 1944. The conscription crisis of 1944 greatly divided the French-speaking and English-speaking people of Canada. Conscription was introduced by our Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King in 1944. In doing this, he went back on his promise to not introduce conscription. The French-speaking people of Canada did not want to be conscripted to a war that did not directly involve Canada. This created a lot of tension throughout Canada and divided Canadians in a similar way to the conscription crisis of World War I. French Canadians were still not happy when William Lyon Mackenzie King introduced conscription if necessary. This event was a large source of tension between the two groups of Canadians, and this tension would not be lost quickly. Well, that's all for my time period. Now on to Richard Head with a continuation of this special on French-English relations. Over to you, Dick. Peace out, suckers.
Hughes was an Orangeman, prone to anti-Catholic sentiments, who was not well liked among the French Canadians. Hughes increased the tensions by sending Anglo-centrics to recruit French Canadians, and by forcing French volunteers in the training camps to speak the English language all the time. Now, Hughes didn't just anger the French Canadians, he also angered the English Canadians. He brought in many different things into the new war regime, including one Ross rifle that was prone to jamming in the wet and muddy conditions of the war, but was perfect for the dry, sunny conditions of the not war. Almost all French Canadians opposed conscription. They felt that they had no particular loyalty to either Britain or France. Led by Henry Bourassa, they felt their only loyalty was to Quebec. English Canadians generally supported the war effort as they felt stronger ties to the British Empire. The conscription crisis of 1917 caused a considerable rift along ethnic lines between Anglophones and Francophones.
Yeah.
Generally, the relations during the World War I era were bad between the Francophones and the Anglophones. In other news, the Bavarian national water polo team challenged Serbia's national water polo team to a friendly match last weekend. Here are the results.
In this international friendly, we have Bavaria and Serbia. Serbia is a very strong nation in the sport, and they've beat Bavaria before. And the gold medal game on the Olympics was won by the Serbians, and the Serbians scored first. Bavaria even things up later with Jakov. Keeper was surprised with that, way far out. 1-1 is the score. And the Serbians take a timeout. And they just strategy and work out because Serbia wins this game 5-4.
For all of us at Late News, you stay fresh, Miss Barron's class. Anglophones and Francophones.